just when you thought you were going to get rid of me, no, I stay on stage and I have more to share. We saw a bunch of data in the last session, and I've got some more detail to go into in terms of like, what do we do? And one of the most common questions that we get is, what is everybody else doing in this space? And the question behind that question, of course, is, how am I doing compared to everybody else in this space? And to figure that out, we need a bit of a maturity model, a maturity map. And so we're going to go through a couple of different frameworks that you guys can use to evaluate that for yourselves. In the last session, we talked about these three things, this transition from now to next, overcoming the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and then figuring out how we make money. There's two problems, though, with all of this. And the first one is that AI is very much like a multi-stage rocket ship, right? Like when you get into it and you start off, it's really violent. It's all shaky and it's kind of scary. But then, you kind of get into the upper, reaches of the Earth's atmosphere and things start to smooth out again until it's time to jettison those fuel rockets, right? And then it gets all shaky and scary and violent again. And this is a great analogy for company growth in general, but it's also a great analogy for AI adoption, because every time we implement something new and try something new, it gets all shaky and scary again. Problem number two with this is that AI is a race. And there are some agencies that are pulling ahead, like number 17 here. And there are others that are kind of, falling behind and maybe tripping over some of the hurdles that we've identified in the last session in their AI adoption. So forgive this sort of cheesy and literal metaphor, but I think it's a good one. And what we need really, sorry, I want to go back really quickly because there's one more point I wanted to make here, which is this race is not about size, right? I think that we're at a moment in time where AI is going to be a great enabler of independent agencies for competing better with larger agencies. It levels the playing field in some really unique ways. And so it's not about size, it's not about level of investment, it's about strategy and change management. And to really kind of get through all of this, we need a map. And since we were using water metaphors before, and ancient mariners used to navigate using star charts, I had AI generate this star chart. I have no idea if it's accurate, but it's a good illustration anyway. So we'll get into this maturity map. Before I get there, though, I want to share kind of 5 core principles that should guide the rest of the conversation. The first one is, do you need an AI strategy? And this reminds me very much of 2008, 2009, shortly after the original iPhone came out, when every CMO was calling and saying, what is my mobile strategy? And the correct answer is, yes, you need to think about mobile, but it's way better to think about a new business strategy that has mobile integrated at its core. And I think it's the same with AI. Yes, you need to think about AI, you need to experiment with AI, but an AI strategy integrated into your core business strategy is much more powerful than an isolated AI strategy. Second is transparency, I think, is critical, both with our employees and with our clients. Our talent needs to know what we believe is going to be the impact on their roles, how it's going to transform the agency. And on the client side, they're beginning to just expect that we're using AI, right? And it's already starting to become part of fee negotiations, so there's little point in trying to hide that from clients. Technology is always in service of business outcomes. This is nothing new to everybody in the room, but it's easy to chase shiny objects, and so we just need to avoid that and focus on always in service of the business objective. The next one is that tech is the easy part. AI can now write its own code, for example. The hard parts are leadership and change management. And I think the more that we acknowledge that allows us to kind of focus on those issues as we roll out AI across our organizations. And then lastly, and we've already kind of talked about this in the last session and in some of the Q&A, but the whole time and materials thing is on borrowed time. AI saves time, and if that's what we're selling, it's going to be really hard to drive growth. So let me take a second to orient us to kind of how this maturity map that we're going to look at works. It has 2 lenses. The first is what I'm calling stages, which is kind of, think about this like audience personas. It's kind of how your agency shows up overall when it comes to AI. And they range from kind of cautious to confident to fragmented and integrated. It's basically the overall posture of the agency. And then dimensions are more kind of levers for growth. They're kind of organizational pillars that we can look at, and there's 4 of these. We'll go through each one in turn. So the thing that's really interesting about the framework is that it can be applied at the organizational level, but with a few tweaks, it can also be applied at the individual level. So it's a good way to measure individual maturity when it comes to AI as well. So let's dive into the 4 dimensions. We're going to start with vision and vibe, right? And This really kind of is intended to capture, like, is there a North Star? Is there support for experimentation, responsible experimentation? Or is there leadership silence and then shadow AI usage where everybody's running around kind of doing their own thing that we may or may not fully know about? The next one is human plus machine muscle. And as we get deeper into this, you'll notice that a lot of these are something and something. And most of them use an ampersand. This one uses a plus symbol, and that was intentional because I think we need to think about it from a collaboration perspective. It's human plus machine, not human or machine or human and machine. It's the power of the two combined and leveraging the strengths that they each uniquely bring to the table. From the tool stack and tinkering perspective, right, is there a clear owner for the process and tool selection process and so forth? And then also, lastly, our use cases and how we're using it in the actual work, right? What are those priority use cases? How do we go about developing those and prioritizing those? All of these things are really important. And most importantly, all of that needs to ladder up to, as we were saying before, sort of next-gen value. How am I delivering a new kind of value or value in a new way to my clients? And now we'll go through the 5 stages. So as I said, there's 2 dimensions. So we just went through, or 2 lenses. We just went through the dimensions. Now we're going to go through the 5 stages. And on this slide, you'll see all 5 stages and then sort of what you might overhear in an agency that's at this stage and kind of the attributes that represent this stage as well. So the skeptic is kind of obvious, not really believing the hype, not really seeing the time savings, struggling to understand the impact. Next up is the dabbler, right? So we're doing some experimentation, we're getting into it, we're starting to play around with it. There's a lot of isolated use, but it's not laddering up to a more enterprise-wide sort of adoption. Then we get to the hustler, and this one is a bit of an intentional double entendre, as the French would say. In the agency world, there's a lot of hustle in terms of just getting after things like aggressively and relentlessly and chasing things. And then there's a little bit, let's be honest, of selling stuff maybe that's a little bit ahead of where our actual capabilities lie. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how I build the mobile practice when I was on the agency side. So I did a bunch of different innovation strategies as well. Next up is the operator, right? So this is where it just becomes part of the plan. It's integrated into our daily workflows. We're seeing repeatable use cases, and we're starting to see the time savings. And then finally, and this is the most advanced stage, is the alchemist, right? So where we're really starting to redefine what's possible and move beyond sort of the obvious use cases. Now, we're going to bring it all together into a handy-dandy table that's going to fit on a single slide. There's going to be a lot of words on this, so I'm not going to have time to go through the whole thing in detail, but if you check the app, it should be in there as a downloadable resource, and we're going to release this as well before the end of the month. So you'll see more on that. But let me orient you again. So we've got the dimensions along the top in columns from left to right, and we've got the 5 stages down the left-hand side in rows. And so it looks a little something like this when you fill it out. It's a good thing to take pictures of as well, but again, it's in the app, and there's more to come from us when we release it publicly. I don't have time to go through the whole thing, like I said, but the goal with this thing is really to help you sort of provide a framework to help you analyze kind of where you're at and what the next logical steps may be. I suspect that most of us are kind of in the middle 3 there, the dabbler, the hustler, and the operator. There's probably a few alchemists in the room as well. I'd be surprised if there's many skeptics in the room based on the Forrester data and the poll that we did at the top. But if there are skeptics, come and find me during a break. We'll have a conversation about that. And the good thing with this framework also is that you might not be at the same stage across all 4 dimensions. You might be a little bit ahead and a little bit behind depending on kind of the adoption curve. And that's what's really fun about the framework is it enables you to kind of think through that, right? So for example, your agency might look like this, where your vision and sort of that machine plus human collaboration thing is a little bit ahead of tools and tinkering and where we're at from a use case adoption and integrating it into the work perspective. Or you might look like this, where the vision is there, the tools are there, but the human plus machine collaboration muscle is still building, and we're still working through those use cases, right? And so again, I think it's a good way to sort of evaluate where you are across each one of those dimensions. So the next question then is like, how do we go? How do we advance, right? And the goal with all of this is to identify kind of where you're at on that curve, and then figure out how to get to the next step, both across and down that chart. And how do we sort of leverage the power and ride the AI rocket ship? I think there's 6 things that every agency needs, and I'm calling this sort of the non-negotiable AI hygiene kit. I'll go through these really quickly. So the first is the AI manifesto. So this is kind of like that North Star. It's what your agency believes to be true about artificial intelligence and its role in creativity and ethics in innovation. This is really useful for internal cultural building and external positioning. The AI policy might get confused with the manifesto, but this is much more about just sort of clarifying, acceptable use policies, disclosure requirements, et cetera, right? This is useful for avoiding oops moments in the future. Governance structure, again, is kind of similar, but it's about establishing like who owns the decision-making process when it comes to AI and the specific tools that we're using. Who's analyzing the terms and conditions across all of the different platforms that we may be evaluating or experimenting with. Tool access and budget, right? Like we talked about this before. Free tools are not going to scale, so we have to carve out budget and empower teams with enterprise-grade tools and paid tools. Performance measurement, we need to figure out what the definition of success is. Are we looking at saving hours? Are we looking at increased quality, increased productivity? You can't optimize what you don't track or measure. Then lastly, training and upskilling, which we talked about in the last session. This is ongoing investment in prompt literacy, critical evaluation, and so forth. This next one is kind of intended to be like, how do you get to that next stage across all four of the dimensions here? And again, I'll build this out. I won't have time to go through all of them in detail, but we'll hit a couple of the highlights. But again, it should be available as a download in the app. So the first thing is, if you're, and I should say also, on the left-hand side is for kind of if you're earlier in the journey, and on the right-hand side is if you're a little bit more advanced in your adoption of AI. So from a vision and vibe perspective, if you're a beginner, I think it's time to think about, a leadership workshop where you get everybody together to think about what does that AI manifesto look like and begin to put those policies in place. If you're advanced, I think kind of taking a multi-pronged approach to attacking the potential future of irrelevance, I think is critical here, right? Like potentially empowering your AI council to really attack the legacy business, to think through all of the workflows and where AI can be leveraged and what does it mean from a business model and pricing model perspective. Human plus machine, at the early stages, I think it's important to create safe space for sharing and use case discussions. If you're already moving, thinking about discipline-specific training, craft-specific training. From a tool and tinkering perspective, if you're on the beginning side, it's important to carve out budget for tools, as we've talked about. If you're more advanced, I think some of you are already here in the room, right? But creating custom solutions, leveraging AI for your clients that are specific to you or your client needs. Doesn't have to be huge and complex. It can be a custom GPT that takes 10 minutes to build. But those custom solutions, I think, are important. And then finally, use cases in the work. So if you're in the beginning stages, you need to experiment. You need to start playing around. So identify and do an audit and identify 2 or 3 places where AI can be used to leverage and accelerate workflows. And if you're more advanced, you've probably already got some work at this point that you can celebrate. So it's time to package those into case studies for press and pitches and awards. All right, so if we haven't beat this horse enough, we need to talk about the pricing model and the elephant in the room. So we looked at the data. Already 70% of us are forecasting significant impacts on our business model and the composition of our orgs over the next 2 years. The question is, what do we do? How do we get to that nirvana state of a new model? Again, this session is not designed to get into details there, but we've got another day and a half of programming that is going to get into that. And these are just a few sessions that you'll see over the next little while that will go into that, right? Microsoft is going to talk about agentic AI and its impact on the agency space. Jack from Agency Agile is going to come up and talk about the new agency and client playbook, and on and on and on. Brian from Lodestar is going to come up and talk about a framework for pricing based on value. So more to come there. I want to leave you, though, with just a couple of parting gifts, if you will, or additional frameworks and thoughts for how we can address specifically the business model piece of the maturity curve. The first thing I think is to acknowledge that there's more than one way to work with AI. In fact, there's many ways, not just from a use case perspective, but in terms of the level of human plus machine collaboration. And this framework is loosely based on the self-driving vehicle world, which is basically level 0 is there's no AI, and I don't think that's realistic. Most cars today and most of our processes today are using some flavor of AI. And level 5 is steering wheel optional in the vehicle. We took a Waymo on our way over here. It had a steering wheel in it, but there was no driver. So that level of automation is that level 5. And you can see on this slide, there's some examples, high-level examples of different tasks that are common across agency workflows. Again, we won't have time to go through this in detail, but this maps out sort of those 5 levels by discipline and lists kind of common tasks that go along with each one of those 5 levels. This may not work for everybody. I think you can adapt it based on your shop, but it's a good framework for thinking about how do I feel about human plus machine collaboration at every stage of this process, and what does it mean across disciplines, which then will translate into something like this, where we can start to measure shifts in allocation, which I talked about before, in terms of looking at it from a cost perspective anyway. So as we get farther along the spectrum of human plus machine collaboration, perhaps our human costs are going down as we're automating more and more and letting the AI take more control. But our tech and data costs are likely to go up. Is this something that we want to share with clients? Maybe. But I think it comes back to really wanting to shift that conversation away from hours and more towards value and outcomes. But it's a good tool to use internally for measuring at least that cost structure. Also, this question of what does tomorrow's organization look like? So today we largely live with this triangle. Is it going to be a diamond where the junior level, entry level talent starts to get compressed, or is it going to be an hourglass where maybe the middle management gets a little bit compressed? To be determined, but I think kind of thinking through these models again is important for how we frame the future. I'm almost out of time, but I do want to point you back to our Gen AI blueprint, which we started publishing over the summer last year. In particular, chapter 3 has a link to an Excel template that you can all download and fill out called the AI Readiness Assessment. It's also a maturity model. It's a different maturity model than the one that we just looked at. It looks at 6 dimensions and goes really deep, but if you're looking for something with a little bit more rigor than the framework that I shared, this is a great starting point. It goes really, really deep and is challenging to fill out, but it's a good guide. It'll lead you to a model that looks like this, from laggard to leader, and then steps to get from each stage to the next step. Again, all of this is going to be available as a download, and apologies that I'm kind of flying through it. But I wanted to introduce the concept. So I'll leave you with this, right? I think success in the AI area requires these 3 things. It's about figuring out what the efficiency gains look like, what that means from a pricing and profitability standpoint. It's about figuring out that human plus machine balance and leaning into the unique strengths of each. And then finally, experimenting with a fundamental reinvention of the business and how that works moving forward. And that's all I have. Thank you.